Scott is morose, melancholy, miserable, and Styles, being the supportive best friend, resolves to get him drunk. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Werewolves can't get drunk, presumably because of their super healing powers. I guess it's lore now, whatever. But Styles does get drunk, spectacularly so. The boys are interrupted by grown men. Scott intimidates them with his wolf side and smashes the liquor bottle to prove a point. Styles is alarmed as this has never happened before, and this does set the tone for the rest of the episode, but I appreciate this little moment where Scott still has time to make sure Styles safely gets in the car so he can drive him home. It's cute. Meanwhile, those same men become the latest victims of the Alpha, this time being burned alive. This is Season 1, Episode 8, Lunatic. Scott's attitude continues into the next day, where he brushes off his mom's attempts to console him through his breakup with Allison. The Argents, who, if you remember, were not the villains of last week's episode, have dialed up protection over Allison in response. But Kate, as usual, is a little more willing to bend the rules for her. Both Allison and Lydia seem to have mostly recovered from their nightmare, and Allison wonders out loud if she made a mistake by breaking up with Scott. But Lydia points out that Scott locked them in the classroom and presumably left them for dead. Of course, we know that it was to protect his friends from himself, but they don't know that. Still, Allison seems more unsure than she was in the previous episode. As for Styles, his response is to grow more concerned. Scott's behavior so close to the full moon and the events of the previous episode have rattled Styles' confidence. And as the sheriff's department continues to investigate the events of the last episode, remember that they think Derek was the killer, Styles urges his dad to be careful, even if he can't tell him why.
Dad, you've never dealt with this kind of thing before, okay? At least not like this.
Our friends conveniently all have to take a big test together, even though Mr. Harris is a chemistry teacher and the test is on economics, and Scott tries to reach out to Allison. During the test, Scott grows increasingly distracted by his senses, what he hears, what he feels, and even his vision twists. In the last episode, Scott confessed to Styles that he felt the urge to kill his friends, and his hallucinations reflect that fear. Overwhelmed, Scott runs out of the classroom. Styles quickly follows like the dutiful best friend and realizes that Scott was having a panic attack. And we find out that Styles used to get panic attacks too, after his mom died when he was young. And this is the first time we learn anything about Styles' mom. Until now, she was simply absent from the story. But the fact that she died when Styles was so young helps contextualize why Styles is so panicked over the thought of losing his dad. This also explains why Scott might not feel that same fear for his own mom, as he hasn't experienced that kind of loss. In fact, Scott has mostly grown up without the active presence of his mom, due to her job, and almost completely without the presence of his dad, because he left them. Therefore, the distance in their relationship versus Styles' growing protectiveness over the sheriff is an unfortunate consequence of this dynamic. But Scott thinks his panic has to do with more than just heartbreak or Allison. Remember that it wasn't just his emotions that went into overdrive, but his wolf senses too. It's probably because of the full moon.
Because if I get out, I think I might kill someone.
Back at Argent HQ, Chris and Kate get ready for the incoming full moon with a little help from this guy.
Dad, you've never dealt with this kind of thing before, okay? At least not like this.
I know, which is why I brought in people who have. State detective.
Even though the Alpha is stronger on the full moon, it's also more disoriented and thus easier to capture, and if they happen to find Derek along the way, then...
You find him. You kill him. You cut him in half. Anybody want a cookie?
Jackson and Allison meet up for lunch, and after an uncomfortably intimate moment, Allison wonders again if she made a mistake by breaking up with Scott. This time, Scott is close enough to overhear, his anger growing as Jackson asserts that Scott got exactly what he deserved. There's also this line.
You want the bite?
What?
Do you want a bite?
Suggesting Jackson is closer to finding answers than we think. At lacrosse practice, Scott's rage grows quietly, contrasting almost harshly with Styles' unbridled joy at both of them moving up the food chain, Scott becoming co-captain and Styles making first line.
This is about taking your unit, McCall's unit, we're making one big unit.
This scene is really awkward. Basically, Styles picks up on Scott's ability to sense other people's emotions and asks him to find out if Lydia feels any sort of attraction to him. In the meantime, Scott is still exhibiting that quiet, concealed rage.
I love you. I love you. You're my best friend in the whole world.
Now this scene is really interesting. We spend so little time with Lydia, just Lydia, that any moment alone with her feels important, a brief look inside her mind. At first, Lydia is flirtatious, offering to open up to Scott about the events of the other night, which is a direct contrast to how she talked about Scott to Allison earlier.
Scott locked us in the classroom and left us for dead. Because I know you locked us in there to protect us. Because I know that when a guy risks his life for you, you should be grateful.
But Scott, who seems to have slipped back into his normal demeanor, isn't thinking about Styles or Lydia.
Do you know if Allison still likes me?
And you can just feel the rejection on Lydia's face, who's already feeling like she's losing her boyfriend to Allison too. So she tries a different tactic. Of course, Allison still likes Scott, but just as friends. And this hurts Scott enough to send him back into wolf mode. Lydia puts some moves on him again, and this time, he responds. We all love a light mess, but Lydia has been feeling neglected lately. Even though she came up with a brilliant plan to help Scott face off against the Alpha, Jackson has been ignoring her, even treating her harshly.
Well, it's been there for days. You won't tell me what happened.
If you actually care.
I go back and forth about whether these two are in an abusive relationship or if they're just mutually bad for each other. For now, I side with the latter. Both of them have been pretty nasty to each other, though Jackson is taking it farther than usual. And beyond that, Lydia has no one to talk to about what she's been through, how she's feeling.
You ask me. Of course, nobody asks me.
So it makes sense how she's acting around Scott. Back in Pack Mentality, we saw a glimpse of this when Lydia started flirting with Scott after he began to beat Jackson in bowling. Lydia responds to shifts in power. It's a part of her greater need to be recognized and validated. She constructs her identity based on whoever she's trying to please, hiding the real, more valuable and vulnerable parts of herself. And this is an interesting contrast to Allison, who has tried to stay firm in a certain type of identity because she doesn't know what her real self looks like. Of course, the longer Lydia tries to create a facade based on who people think she is, the more she'll fail to come to terms with the things that she's been through and how that will affect her long term. But the reason I like this scene is because the story is told from both sides. Scott needs someone to talk to, Lydia needs someone to talk to, and they just so happen to be talking to each other. I like to think of this moment as the starting point for their relationship for the rest of the show. But Scott's job was not to make out with Lydia, it was to find out if Lydia had any feelings for Styles. But I'm sure that'll go down well. Scott's rage only grows on the pitch as Jackson's lackeys continue to intimidate him. Remember, Scott's co-captain now, and Jackson takes this to mean Scott has stolen something precious from him.
And then you start to feel like you do anything. Anything in the world to get it back.
This results in an incident where Scott hurts Danny, and Styles is surprised that he doesn't even care. Which sucks, because just a few minutes ago, Danny was actually defending Scott when Jackson tried to put him down. Lydia runs onto the field, Jackson notices her smeared lip gloss, and Styles makes a connection. Meanwhile, Kate is teaching Allison to defend herself. If you remember, Allison was mostly useless during the events of night school, a realization that has taken its toll on Allison herself. One minute she's shooting a taser and feeling badass, and the next she's crumpled in grief. She's distraught over Scott, but also over being put in such a traumatizing situation. For all the times Allison has spent trying to put on a persona of a girl who has her shit together, she's really not. And that's okay. I also want to note that Allison doesn't talk about Scott casually. She brings him up multiple times in this episode. It's fair to say that the breakup is hurting Allison just as much as it's hurting Scott, even if she doesn't show it. A theme we've been discussing throughout the season is Allison's relationship to identity, who she wants to be, who she doesn't want to be, and how these motivations are influenced by the people around her. And I think this scene gives really important insight into Allison as a character. She starts off lighthearted, having told Kate that she wants to learn how to protect herself, but that facade falls away once her victim, the bear, is actually attacked. Now she feels weak again. Imagine being in Allison's position, confronting your boyfriend for lying to you about a life or death situation, only for him to lock you in a classroom and leave you for dead.
And then he just started acting so strange, and now I don't know what to believe.
With that perspective, she was totally justified in breaking up with Scott. But dumping Scott doesn't erase her heartbreak or her fear. In this moment, Allison wants to be the cool girl, but she doesn't have the heart for it, and she finds herself confessing all of this to Kate.
I'm terrified. I'm always terrified. I act like I know what I'm doing, but I don't.
Styles comes over after practice to help Scott prepare for the full moon and runs into Melissa McCall. They share a moment where Melissa confesses that Scott doesn't really talk to her anymore, so she doesn't feel like she knows if he's okay. It's complicated for Styles, who knows Scott is absolutely not okay, but also knows that he can't tell Melissa why. It's almost a reflection of the moment Styles had with his dad in the beginning of the episode, warning him to be careful due to the full moon. Because Scott is acting out of character, Styles serves as his emotional conduit.
Oh my god!
Hey, that looks familiar. Scott and Styles enter a tense standoff where Styles tries to convince him to get ready for the full moon, but Scott displays the same predatory behavior we saw in night school in response. Styles succeeds, tricks Scott, and handcuffs him to the radiator, and finally confronts him about Lydia. Meanwhile, Allison stops by a bike store where she runs into Jackson. Feeling melancholy, she's thinking about returning to her childhood passion of archery. It makes sense. When your world has shifted so dramatically, you might return to the things that are familiar, and in Allison's case, the things that make you feel safe. Jackson picks up that Allison needs someone to talk to about the events of night school, because he does too. And I know it's a manipulation tactic, but Jackson isn't totally lying, and Allison really does need someone to talk to. It just sucks that it won't be with someone genuine. Back at the McCall house, Styles and Scott still struggle. This happens, which has been widely regarded as a racist microaggression, and while it seems like just a regular outburst of anger at first, the harm is in its callback to American history, and how it is reflected in this particular dynamic between Styles and Scott. The fact that Styles will implicitly always have that kind of access to power over Scott.
You think I'm gonna let you put these on? Chain me up like a dog?
But this is what I mean about Scott's place as a person of color in the narrative, rather than drawing a parallel between that identity and his identity as a werewolf. The implications are different depending on which identity you focus on. As a werewolf, Scott is dangerous to Styles, no question. But as a person of color, he's not. That is the entire fallacy of racism. Of course, that is part of a larger conversation with casting people who are typically stereotyped as dangerous, aggressive, and animalistic in roles that require them to be, well, an animal. Anyway, as for the story, Styles gets his moment of confrontation when he rips into Scott for kissing Lydia.
You kissed her, Scott, okay? You kissed Lydia. That's my... like the one girl that I...
And it is sad. Even though Styles doesn't deserve Lydia or anything like that, Scott still knows how Styles feels about her. And that betrayal is what hurts Styles more. All day he's been trying to chalk it up to Scott being influenced by the full moon and being out of control, but this betrayal is too specific for him to write off. And Scott just makes it worse. Not only did he kiss Lydia, but she made the move on him first, meaning Styles never had a chance. Scott wastes no time rubbing this in. I go back and forth on how much responsibility Scott bears in this situation. Since I've likened his story to that of an assault survivor undergoing post-traumatic stress disorder, you can make the argument that Scott is currently experiencing some sort of manic episode, where he's not in control, he's hallucinating things, and generally acting out of character. So, do we blame him for the things he does while experiencing an episode? My gut says no, but that he still is responsible for hurting people nonetheless, and that he has to atone for that. I think this gets into a conversation about mental illness and how certain mental illnesses can cause people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, but I also don't want to imply that people with certain mental illnesses are inherently more dangerous, like Scott is with his werewolf abilities. For now, it doesn't seem like the narrative is necessarily trying to blame Scott, but it also gives people like Styles the space to react to the things he's done.
There's a full moon tonight. You should see how the ER brings out all the nut jobs.
Oh.
Yeah. You know, it's actually where they came up with the word lunatic.
My theory about Scott experiencing a manic episode also comes from the fact that Scott suddenly switches personalities. At first, he's taunting Styles, being this terrifying, predatory self, And then he starts to beg Styles to let him out, to understand what he's going through, and to help him stop the pain. And Styles, unfortunately, doesn't know what to do, and feels like the only thing he can do is not help Scott for his own good. So when the full moon finally comes, and Scott is literally screaming and trying to get out, Styles can do nothing but sit there and cover his ears. But at the end of it, Scott still gets the strength to break out of his chains and escape into the night. Jackson and Allison have started confessing to each other that what happened at the school is more supernatural than they think. I think of this scene as a reflection, as all dynamics in this show are, of the earlier scene between Scott and Lydia. Both couples have separated in some sense and are turning to each other's partners for guidance. In each scene, both characters hold an equal amount of weight. Jackson's reactions to Allison's confessions also tell his story. Allison knows that the people in her life are lying to her, and Jackson knows that Scott and Derek are hiding something from everyone, and he just might know what. Together, they tell a more collective story of two characters trying to uncover a mystery. It's a more productive reflection because Jackson and Allison actually get close to figuring out what was in the halls of the school that night, unlike Scott and Lydia, who gave into their more destructive emotions. By this time, Scott has arrived, incensed by what he thinks is Jackson and Allison hooking up, and nearly attacks them, before he is attacked himself. Surprised, Derek's back, and he's trying to calm Scott down. When he does, Scott is terrified of himself, of what he's becoming.
What's happening to me? Exactly what he wants to happen.
Meanwhile, Styles has been running through town trying to find Scott before he runs into an ambulance and is terrified that his worst fear has come true, that his dad has been attacked.
Styles, I'm always careful.
Dad, you've never dealt with this kind of thing before, okay? At least not like this.
Thankfully, that's not the case. The Argents pull up too. Kate believes that the second werewolf that they've been tracking this whole time, not Derek and not the Alpha, might not just be smaller, but younger too. She refers to Styles as another friend of Allison's, without any reference to Scott. To me, that means they don't suspect that Scott could be the other werewolf. That also means that any other teenage boy is now at risk. Derek is different after his attack. That same solemn look that we saw in Heart Monitor is back again. I think of it as him accepting that Scott doesn't need his help.
Wait.
Except he does. Scott, finally, after 8 long traumatic episodes, admits something that he's been denying ever since he got the bite.
I can't do this. I want to be on the team. I want to go out with Allison. I want a semi-freaking normal life. Maybe I can do this. Maybe it's not that bad. I can't be this and be with Allison.
So Scott asks for something he hasn't asked before, a cure. Derek says he's heard of one that you have to kill the one that bit you to be cured. And of course, isn't it convenient that Derek has already planned to kill the Alpha, now he just needs Scott to do it. The closing moments of this episode deliver another important conclusion. Scott's attack on Jackson's car ripped off one of his claws, and if you remember in episode 2, Second Chance at First Line, Jackson discovered one of Scott's gloves with a tear on it. Jackson puts 2 and 2 together and makes a discovery. I'm surprised by how much heavy lifting this episode does, given that it's just a follow-up to a very dramatic previous episode. But in 40 minutes, we get Jackson and Allison uncovering a mystery, Lydia getting more of the spotlight, Styles getting challenged, Scott facing real life-threatening consequences, and all the dynamics in between. It's a subtle episode that matters a lot in the grand arc of the season. So I want to focus on Scott. Lydia, Jackson, Allison, and Styles, each in their own way, get to verbally react to the events of night school. But Scott really doesn't. He gets tunnel vision by hyper-focusing on Allison and what the breakup has done to him, and by focusing on the emotional toll, he forgets about the physical and psychological toll. What I mean is that Scott doesn't realize how out of character he's acting, which is why I use Styles as our emotional conduit. It's through Styles we can understand that Scott isn't just grumpy or hurt, he's seriously going through something. Remember that Scott's anger is not actually a method of controlling his shift. It's what causes him to shift. Instead, it's his compassion and the need to take care of others that helps him control his abilities. So it makes sense that an out-of-character Scott is an aggressive Scott who's being influenced by the Alpha who wants him to shift. And it starts with that panic attack. Scott's panic attack, according to Stiles, is a result of his heartbreak. It is also true that panic attacks are a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that we've used to analyze Scott's behavior throughout the season as a victim of assault himself. It is also true that Scott's relationship to Allison is more than just a high school romance. Allison's family, her social status, and her wealth are all elements of a normal life that Scott has spent all season trying to achieve.
I want to be on the team. I want to go out with Allison. I want a semi-freaking normal life.
That means that Allison leaving Scott isn't just heartbreak, it's also a break in his expectations. Scott's belief that he could balance his life as a werewolf with his life as a normal high school student is ruined as he faces the consequences of trying to do so in night school. That's why he comes to this conclusion at the end of the episode.
Can't be this and be with Allison.
So I think we can use this episode to look at the mental effects of PTSD. Scott hallucinates about killing his friends, just as he dreamt of doing so in pack mentality. He experiences panic attacks, like we talked about, and switches personalities between the Scott that we know and the Scott that we fear. He even talks about a cure, an idea that has been widely used in discussing the experiences of people with mental or physical disabilities, in either dehumanizing them or addressing their needs. Which is to say that maybe the metaphor of being a werewolf is not tied to race, or just the obstacles of puberty as most teen supernatural shows do, but firmly with trauma, as I have discussed since the first episode. And with trauma, sometimes, comes the development of a mental illness in order to deal with that trauma. Of course, that comparison has its own bag of worms. For example, I would be implying that since the Argents are somewhat justified in hunting werewolves under the guise of protecting the town, that it is somewhat justified to villainize people living with a mental illness, which is unequivocally untrue. On the other hand, you could make the argument that the Argents' violent response is an example of what not to do, and how the resolution of the plot only comes with the resolution of understanding that people need to be cared for, not treated like villains. I don't know. I'm sticking with my metaphor of Scott as an assault survivor, as someone living with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I hesitate to go any further from there. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.